Before this week is over, something that has been quietly shaping your life behind the scenes may disappear forever, and the most remarkable part is that many people will not recognize the moment it happens. They will only notice the absence afterward. They will wake up one day and realize that a weight they carried for years is no longer there, that a familiar emotional pattern has stopped controlling their reactions, that a chapter they thought would follow them indefinitely has somehow come to an end. On Monday, June 8th, the last quarter moon forms in Pisces at 17 degrees and 38 minutes, and this moment carries far more significance than a routine lunar transition. Think of it as a precise instrument designed to remove what has overstayed its purpose. Beneath the surface, three deeply embedded tendencies are being targeted. Patterns that may have influenced your decisions, relationships, emotional responses, and sense of identity for much longer than you realize. Once this process is complete, there is no returning to the version of yourself that existed before it. Yet what makes this lunar phase truly extraordinary is not merely the moon itself. It is the larger sequence unfolding around it. The days surrounding June 8th are arranged with such uncanny precision that they resemble pieces of a larger design fitting together perfectly. Every alignment seems to arrive exactly when it is needed, creating the feeling that an invisible intelligence has been preparing this turning point long before you became aware of it. If recently you have felt an unusual pressure building inside you, a heaviness that settles in your chest without explanation, a sensation that something wants to leave your life but cannot yet find the exit, then you are already interacting with this energy. There is a specific reason for that feeling, and understanding it changes everything. But before we arrive there, you need to see the larger landscape, because this moon is not appearing in isolation. It is emerging against one of the most dramatic, energetic shifts of the entire year. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the story that has been unfolding for a long time. For years, the slower-moving planets occupied Pisces, creating a collective atmosphere saturated with emotional complexity. During that period, Saturn traveled through Pisces. Neptune occupied Pisces as well. Together they immersed individuals and the collective consciousness in themes of surrender, uncertainty, emotional overwhelm, spiritual searching, grief, and blurred boundaries. Many people struggle to distinguish between their own emotions and the emotions they absorbed from everyone around them. It became easy to lose direction, easy to drift, easy to carry burdens that were never truly theirs. There was a feeling of dissolving into circumstances rather than actively shaping them. Yet, that chapter has already begun closing. The transition is not approaching. It is already underway. Neptune made its definitive entrance into Aries in January. Saturn followed into Aries in February. Uranus shifted into Gemini during April. Jupiter is preparing to enter Leo at the end of this month. This migration of planetary energy represents a profound change in atmosphere. The dominant currents are no longer flowing through water. They are moving through fire and air. The pace is accelerating. The demands are increasing. The emphasis is shifting toward action, courage, expression, movement, and conscious participation. The energetic climate of this year bears little resemblance to what came before it. The challenge, however, is that planetary movements happen faster than human adaptation. The sky may have moved on, but parts of you may still be standing in the old landscape. Emotional residue does not disappear the moment a transit ends. Old coping mechanisms do not automatically dissolve because a planet changes signs. Fragments of previous lessons often linger beneath awareness, quietly influencing behavior. Unresolved attachments, outdated beliefs, lingering grief, unconscious fears, and karmic echoes can remain active long after the cosmic environment that created them has vanished. This is exactly where the last quarter moon enters the story. Its purpose is not to begin something new. Its purpose is to clear space. It functions like a final sweep through the corridors of your inner world, collecting what no longer belongs in the future that is trying to emerge. If lately you have felt suspended between two realities, unable to fully return to who you were, yet unable to clearly see who you are becoming, this lunar phase explains why. You are standing in a threshold space, and thresholds always feel uncomfortable before they reveal their purpose. What many people fail to recognize is that this process did not begin on June 8th. The moon simply marks the culmination. The actual work started days earlier. On June 1st, Mercury entered Cancer and immediately altered the way thoughts were processed. Logic became intertwined with emotion, memory became louder, reflection became more personal. Instead of analyzing experiences from a distance, people found themselves emotionally reliving them. Forgotten conversations resurfaced. Old memories appeared unexpectedly. Situations that seemed finished returned to awareness as though asking for one final review. Then June 3rd arrived, bringing Mercury into a square with Neptune. This was the moment many people began feeling lost inside their own minds. Clarity became difficult to access. Distinguishing intuition from fear became increasingly complicated. Questions that normally required simple answers suddenly felt tangled and uncertain. If you have spent this week repeatedly doubting yourself, revisiting decisions, questioning your perceptions, or wondering whether you can trust your own instincts, this alignment helps explain why. It created a temporary fog, not to mislead you, but to reveal how much certainty you have been seeking outside yourself. Then came June 6th, when the moon entered Pisces, and something deeper awakened. Emotions that had been pushed aside began surfacing with surprising intensity. Old grief returned. Attachments thought to be resolved suddenly demanded attention. Feelings that seemed buried emerged again. This was not a setback, it was preparation. The last quarter moon requires something to release. It requires material ready to be transformed. Everything rising to the surface now is appearing because it can finally leave. That is why these emotions feel so vivid. That is why memories seem unusually present. That is why certain people, situations, and unresolved experiences keep appearing in your thoughts. They are not returning to remain. They are returning to complete their departure. And as we move closer to June 8th, the true psychological purpose of the last quarter moon begins to reveal itself, because what it does to the human mind is far more powerful than most people have ever been taught to understand. One of the greatest misunderstandings in modern astrology is the assumption that only the new moon and the full moon matter. Most people treat everything in between as background movement, a transition period with little significance. Yet the phase arriving on June 8th carries a very different purpose, one that reaches much deeper than manifestation or release. In fact, this stage of the lunar cycle has long been associated with one of the most profound psychological turning points a person can experience. Dane Rudyard described the last quarter moon as a crisis in consciousness. Notice what that means. Not a crisis of circumstances, not a crisis involving other people, not a crisis unfolding in your career, your finances, or your relationships. This is an internal confrontation, a moment when awareness advances faster than comfort can keep up. Something inside you suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. A realization emerges with such force that it changes the way you see yourself. A belief that once felt natural begins to feel foreign. A personal narrative you have repeated for years starts sounding hollow. A role you have performed so long that it became part of your identity suddenly reveals itself as something you outgrew long ago. These moments rarely arrive softly. They arrive like a flash of light illuminating a room that has been dark for years. In a single instant, details you never noticed become impossible to overlook. That is why this phase can feel so unsettling. The discomfort does not come from the universe imposing change upon you. The discomfort comes from seeing the truth clearly enough that pretending is no longer possible. Imagine wearing a mask for so long that you forget it is there. Then one day, You catch your reflection and recognize that the face you have been presenting is not truly yours. The shock is not caused by the mask. The shock comes from realizing how long you have mistaken it for yourself. This is the deeper mechanism operating beneath the surface of the last quarter moon. Patterns that once seemed normal begin revealing their hidden cost. Habits that felt familiar begin feeling restrictive. Emotional structures that once provided security begin resembling walls. Once that awareness arrives, there is no returning to ignorance. You cannot unknow what you have seen. You cannot convince yourself that a cage is freedom after recognizing the bars surrounding you. This brings us back to that strange sensation many people have been carrying recently. Perhaps you have felt an emotional pressure building without understanding why. Perhaps there has been a heaviness lingering in your chest, an invisible weight that seems disconnected from any obvious cause. Maybe you have sensed that something inside is trying to move, trying to leave, trying to complete a process that your conscious mind has not fully identified yet. If so, what you are experiencing may not be random at all. The transformation associated with this lunar phase often begins long before the exact moment arrives. Conscious awareness is frequently the last piece to catch up. At a deeper level, your inner self may already recognize what has reached its expiration point. The emotional pressure you feel is not evidence that something is wrong. It is evidence that something is ready to change. The crisis has already begun beneath the surface. What is happening now is that your conscious mind is finally receiving the message. And when we examine the symbolic language surrounding June 8th, the picture becomes even more remarkable. Every degree of the zodiac carries a symbolic image known as a Sabian symbol, a visual code that provides additional layers of meaning to astrological events. The symbols activated during this last quarter moon create a narrative so relevant to the emotional experiences many people are having right now that it almost feels impossible to dismiss. The moon, positioned at 18 degrees Pisces, is associated with an image of villagers gathered beneath a massive tent, witnessing an extraordinary performance. Consider the emotional significance of that image. People coming together because they are moved by the same experience. Individuals finding connection not through obligation, status, or convenience, but through genuine resonance. It speaks of belonging, shared understanding, and the magnetic pull of authentic community. Now place that beside the sun at 18 degrees Gemini. Its symbol depicts two men conversing in their native language while surrounded by a foreign environment. They exist within a crowd that does not fully understand them, yet they immediately recognize one another. Despite being immersed in unfamiliar surroundings, they discover connection through a language only they share. Together, these symbols reveal something profoundly important. They suggest that much of the exhaustion you have been carrying may come from attempting to gain acceptance in spaces that were never designed for your truth. You may have spent years translating yourself into forms that felt more acceptable. You may have softened your convictions, edited your personality, concealed your deeper thoughts, or reshaped your authentic voice so that others would feel comfortable. On the surface, this may have seemed necessary. Yet, over time, the effort becomes draining. Constant self-translation requires enormous energy. It creates a quiet form of loneliness, because no matter how much approval you receive, it is approval directed toward a version of you that is incomplete. The symbolism of June 8th challenges that pattern directly. It suggests that your true community cannot recognize you if you are constantly hiding your real language. The people capable of understanding your deeper nature already exists. The resonance already exists. The tent already exists. But access to that connection requires authenticity. If you continue shrinking yourself to fit environments that demand less of who you are, you may never discover the spaces where your full expression is welcomed naturally. This realization can be emotional because it forces an uncomfortable question. How much of your life has been spent seeking validation from audiences who were never meant to understand you in the first place? This insight connects directly to the first major pattern being dismantled by the Pisces last quarter moon. For many people, this may be the most challenging revelation of all. The pattern is self-sacrifice disguised as virtue, not the obvious kind that attracts attention, but the quiet version that happens behind closed doors. It appears when you consistently prioritize everyone else's emotional needs while neglecting your own. It appears when you keep saying yes, despite feeling an internal no. It appears when you become the person everyone relies upon while secretly feeling depleted. It appears when you absorb the struggles of others until you can no longer distinguish their burdens from your own. Over time, this behavior can become so normalized that it feels like an expression of kindness. Yet beneath the surface, something else is often operating. Pisces, at its highest expression, embodies compassion, empathy, and spiritual connection. Yet every sign carries a shadow. The shadow side of Pisces can manifest as martyrdom, the belief that suffering proves worthiness, that personal sacrifice automatically equals love, that abandoning yourself somehow makes you more spiritual, more generous, or more deserving. For years, this belief may have shaped your choices without you realizing it. But now the Gemini Sun enters the story with remarkable clarity. Gemini examines assumptions. Gemini asks questions. Gemini exposes contradictions. Under its influence, illusions become difficult to maintain. And the truth emerging through this lunar phase is direct. Self-abandonment is not the same thing as love. Chronic self-sacrifice is not always compassion. In many cases, it is a survival strategy formed long ago, a learned response created to secure safety, acceptance, or belonging. The realization of that truth may feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also the beginning of liberation. And as this moon continues its work, even deeper patterns are preparing to come into view. At some point in your life, without even realizing it, you accepted an invisible agreement. It may have happened in childhood. It may have formed through relationships, family expectations, disappointments, or experiences that taught you a lesson you never consciously questioned. The lesson was simple, but powerful. You began believing that your worth was measured by how much discomfort you could tolerate for the sake of others. The more you carried, the more valuable you felt. The more you sacrificed, the more deserving you believed you became. Over time, this belief settled so deeply into your identity that it stopped feeling like a belief at all. It became automatic. It became the lens through which you viewed compassion, loyalty, and love. Without noticing, you started taking responsibility for emotions that did not belong to you. You absorbed the pain of others. You became the one who understood, the one who endured, the one who stayed strong. Yet beneath that image was a growing exhaustion that few people ever saw. What looked like generosity on the outside often felt like depletion on the inside. What appeared to be kindness frequently came at the cost of your own well-being. The Pisces last quarter moon, arriving on June 8th, is exposing that truth with unusual force. It reaches a point where continuing the pattern requires more energy than releasing it. The familiar strategy no longer works. The burden becomes heavier than the fear of putting it down. And when that moment arrives, something unexpected emerges from deep within. Not rage, not rebellion, not dramatic confrontation. Instead, a calm certainty begins to rise, a quiet refusal. A deeply rooted recognition that says enough. No explanations, no guilt, no negotiation, just a clear understanding that something can no longer continue. That simple no becomes the first step toward an entirely different future, because every meaningful transformation begins with a boundary that was once impossible to imagine. At the same time, another pattern is being challenged by this moon, one that may be even more difficult to recognize because it often disguises itself as coping. When life became overwhelming, when emotions felt too intense, when reality demanded more than you felt capable of giving, you found ways to leave without physically leaving. Perhaps you disappeared into endless thinking. Perhaps you escaped into entertainment, distraction, sleep, fantasy, social media, substances, work, or emotional withdrawal. The form varied, but the purpose remained the same. It created distance between you and whatever felt unbearable. This was never a sign of weakness. It was adaptation. It was survival. The Piscean era encouraged this tendency because the emotional atmosphere itself often felt overwhelming. Boundaries were blurred, feelings were amplified, uncertainty lingered everywhere. Escaping became easier than confronting what seemed impossible to change. Yet the energetic environment of this year is fundamentally different. The sky itself has shifted. The major planetary movement into fire and air signs has changed the tone completely. Fire demands engagement. Air demands awareness. Together, they create an atmosphere where avoidance becomes increasingly uncomfortable. The protective fog that once shielded you begins dissolving whether you consciously choose it or not. This is where the square from the Gemini sun becomes especially significant. Gemini does not allow indefinite avoidance. Gemini asks questions. Gemini seeks clarity. Gemini insists on direct interaction with reality. Under its influence, the spaces where you once hid become illuminated. The situations you deliberately kept undefined begin demanding definition. The conversations you postponed begin demanding expression. The truths you avoided become impossible to overlook. This can feel unsettling because clarity is rarely comfortable at first. When a room has been dark for years, sudden light can be overwhelming. Relationships that once seemed acceptable may reveal dynamics you have been minimizing. Circumstances you convinced yourself would eventually resolve on their own may reveal the need for immediate action. Decisions postponed for months or years may suddenly become impossible to ignore. Yet none of this is happening as punishment. It is happening because awareness creates possibility. You cannot transform what remains hidden. You cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. Every moment spent disconnected from reality delayed your ability to participate fully in your own life. The lifting of the fog on June 8th represents an invitation back into presence. It is an opportunity to reclaim the parts of your experience that have been waiting patiently for your attention. What happens next depends on what you choose to do with the clarity that arrives. Then we reach what may be the most profound shift of all, especially for those who are highly sensitive to emotional and energetic environments. Many people born with strong Piscean influences, or those who naturally absorb the emotional atmosphere around them, know exactly what it feels like to exist without adequate energetic boundaries. You enter a room and instantly sense tension before a single word is spoken. You recognize emotional undercurrents others completely miss. You pick up on sadness, anxiety, frustration, and fear as though they belong to you. Over time, this sensitivity can become so normalized that you stop questioning it. You simply assume feeling overwhelmed is part of who you are. Yet there is a significant difference between empathy and energetic overexposure. One creates connection. The other creates exhaustion. For years, perhaps longer than you realize, you may have been carrying emotions that never originated within you. You may have walked away from conversations feeling depleted without understanding why. You may have agreed to commitments that drained you because refusing felt uncomfortable. You may have mistaken emotional absorption for compassion. The truth is that constantly carrying the weight of other people's inner worlds does not make you more loving. It often disconnects you from yourself. The last quarter moon in Pisces acts as a turning point in this cycle. It represents a moment when the nervous system reaches capacity. A moment when something deep inside finally recognizes that continued absorption is unsustainable. The emotional clutter accumulated over years begins seeking release. The grief you unknowingly carried for others begins separating from your own emotions. The invisible energetic attachments that kept you entangled in situations beyond your control begin weakening. What replaces them is not isolation. It is not emotional coldness. It is not detachment. Instead, something healthier begins forming. Imagine a boundary that allows intimacy without sacrifice, a structure that permits connection while preserving identity, a way of caring deeply without becoming consumed by what you care about. This is the energetic reconstruction taking place beneath the surface. It may explain why your body has recently been requesting more rest. It may explain why solitude feels necessary rather than optional. It may explain why social interactions that once seemed manageable suddenly feel draining. Your system is already preparing for the transition. It is conserving energy because something new is being built. Trust that process. Trust the instinct pulling you inward. Trust the need for space. What emerges after June 8th is not a version of you that feels less. It is a version of you that finally understands where your emotions end and someone else's begin. It is a version of you capable of compassion without self-abandonment, sensitivity without collapse, and connection without losing itself. And this is where many people become afraid. Because hearing that 3 foundational patterns are dissolving simultaneously can sound overwhelming. These are not small habits. These are structures that may have shaped years of decisions, reactions, relationships, and beliefs. They helped create the familiar reality you have known for a very long time. Letting them go can feel like stepping away from solid ground. Yet, as intense as this transformation appears, there is a deeper support system operating beneath it all, one that becomes increasingly visible as this extraordinary week continues to unfold. There is a reason this transformation is arriving in stages rather than all at once. When long-established emotional defenses begin collapsing, the experience is rarely comfortable. These protective structures were not created by accident. They were built over years, sometimes decades, in response to experiences that taught you how to survive. They became familiar. They became predictable. Even when they limited your growth, they provided a sense of safety because they were known. Removing them can create a strange feeling of vulnerability, as though layers that once shielded you from disappointment, rejection, overwhelm, and emotional exposure are suddenly disappearing. For a brief moment, you may feel uncertain about what comes next. Yet what makes this particular sequence of cosmic events so remarkable is that it does not leave you standing alone in that uncertainty. The same sky that initiates the release immediately follows it with support. The same forces that dismantle what is no longer serving you also provide something stronger to take its place. This becomes especially clear on June 9th, when Venus and Jupiter meet in an exact conjunction at 25 degrees Cancer. The timing is extraordinary. Just as the last quarter moon completes its work of exposing and removing outdated emotional patterns, this conjunction arrives like a wave of restoration. Venus represents connection, affection, relationships, and the ways we receive and express love. Jupiter represents expansion, protection, opportunity, blessings, and growth. When these 2 planets unite, their energies amplify one another. Yet what makes this alignment particularly powerful is its location. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, meaning it operates with exceptional strength and effectiveness in this sign. Cancer itself governs emotional security, nurturing, belonging, family, and the experience of feeling genuinely cared for. The result is an atmosphere saturated with emotional generosity and healing potential. Imagine spending years carrying armor so heavy that you forgot what it felt like to move without it. Then imagine finally setting that armor down and discovering that the world is not as hostile as you once believed. That is the essence of this conjunction. It arrives immediately after the release process because the universe is not simply interested in removing old structures. It is interested in replacing them with healthier ones. The walls that fall on June 8th create room for something new to enter on June 9th. Many people spend years longing for deeper connection while simultaneously being unable to receive it because their defenses never allow it close enough. They crave intimacy but fear vulnerability. They desire support but distrust dependence. They want love but remain guarded against it. The events of this week begin changing that equation. As emotional boundaries become healthier, connection becomes safer. As self-abandonment dissolves, authentic love becomes easier to recognize. As energetic overwhelm decreases, relationships gain space to breathe. Situations that once seemed hopelessly tangled may suddenly reveal possibilities that were previously hidden beneath old fears and emotional confusion. Long-standing family dynamics may begin shifting in subtle but meaningful ways. Misunderstandings that persisted for years may soften. More importantly, your relationship with yourself begins changing. You no longer need to prove your worth through sacrifice. You no longer need to earn affection through exhaustion. You no longer need to suffer in order to feel deserving of care. The Venus-Jupiter conjunction reminds you of something many people forget. Genuine love does not require self-destruction. Healthy connection does not demand that you disappear. The deepest forms of belonging emerge when you are fully present as yourself, rather than performing a role designed to secure approval. Yet the sequence does not end there. The cosmos understands that emotional breakthroughs alone are not enough. Inspiration without structure often fades. Clarity without commitment can disappear as quickly as it arrives. This is why June 10th introduces another crucial piece of the puzzle. Mercury forms a square to Saturn, creating a very different atmosphere from the warmth of the previous day. If June 9th feels like emotional nourishment, June 10th feels like construction. Mercury, moving through Cancer, governs emotional thinking, memory, reflection, and internal processing. Saturn in Aries represents discipline, accountability, maturity, and the demand for decisive action. When these two forces collide through a square, the result can feel heavy. Thoughts slow down. Decisions feel significant. Conversations carry greater weight. Words seem more consequential than usual. Many people experience this transit as mental pressure. Yet beneath that pressure lies an important purpose. Every pattern released during the previous days will attempt to re-establish itself. Old habits rarely disappear without resistance. Familiar behaviors often return because they have been practiced repeatedly for years. The impulse to overgive may reappear. The temptation to retreat into avoidance may return. The tendency to absorb emotions that do not belong to you may quietly resurface. Mercury square. Saturn acts as a stabilizing force against those tendencies. It demands conscious participation in your own transformation. It asks whether you are willing to support your emotional breakthroughs with practical choices. This transit teaches a different kind of strength. Not dramatic strength, not performative strength. Quiet strength. The strength required to communicate boundaries without apology. The strength required to say no without lengthy explanations. The strength required to trust your own perception even when others disagree. Saturn is not interested in temporary inspiration. Saturn wants permanence. It wants the lessons of June 8th and June 9th to become integrated into the architecture of your life. It wants emotional realizations to evolve into behavioral changes. It wants insight to become action. It wants healing to become structure. Because of this, the heaviness some people feel on June 10th should not be interpreted as a setback. It is evidence that something substantial is being built. Foundations are rarely light. They require effort. They require patience. They require time to solidify. Yet, once established, they support everything that follows. The seriousness of this transit serves a purpose. It transforms emotional awareness into lasting reality. And this brings us to the larger meaning of the entire sequence. From June 8th through June 10th, a complete process unfolds. First comes release, then comes nourishment. Finally comes integration. By the time these 3 days have completed their work, something fundamental will have shifted. The version of yourself that entered this period carrying emotional burdens that never belonged to you, hiding behind confusion, escaping through distraction, and sacrificing your own needs for the comfort of others will no longer occupy the same position in your life. Something more grounded begins emerging in its place. Not perfection, not enlightenment, not some impossible ideal. Something far more valuable. Clarity, stability, self-awareness, the ability to experience emotions without drowning in them, the ability to care without carrying, the ability to connect without disappearing, the ability to recognize where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Most importantly, the ability to stop seeking validation from environments that were never aligned with your authentic nature and start moving toward the people, places, and experiences that genuinely resonate with who you are becoming. This sequence also represents a larger historical transition. The Piscean chapter that has shaped so much of the collective atmosphere is reaching one of its final moments of completion. Ahead lies a very different energetic landscape. Aries' energy demands initiative. It demands courage. It demands self-definition. It demands action. None of those qualities can fully emerge while you remain burdened by emotional baggage that was never yours to carry. None of them can flourish while confusion dominates perception. None of them can thrive while boundaries remain undefined. That is why June 8th functions like a precise turning point. It removes exactly what must be removed so that the future has room to arrive. And waiting beyond this sequence is the new moon in Gemini on June 14th, offering an entirely fresh beginning. New ideas, new perspectives, new conversations, new intentions, new possibilities. Yet those seeds can only grow because the ground has first been cleared. The emotional debris must leave before something healthier can take root. So if this week feels intense, allow it. If emotions surface, let them move through. If old grief rises, acknowledge it. If clarity arrives and reveals truths you have been avoiding, trust what you see. None of this is happening because you are losing something valuable. What is leaving now belongs to an older version of your life. It belongs to a chapter that taught you important lessons but cannot accompany you where you are going next. You carried those burdens because you had to survive. You developed those defenses because they once served a purpose. But survival is not the same thing as living. The deeper invitation of this week is not simply to release the past. It is to recognize that you no longer need to organize your entire existence around protection. A new chapter is opening, one that asks for presence instead of avoidance, authenticity instead of performance, and participation instead of survival. If this message found you at exactly the right moment, take a moment to reflect on what is already shifting within you. Share your experience below because your journey may help someone else understand their own. And if you would like to continue exploring these powerful cosmic transitions together, be sure to subscribe and join this growing community. Thank you for spending this time here. And until we meet again, take good care of yourself and trust the process unfolding before you.